This week is the annual Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. I'm doing a talk about the music for Moss, so I thought maybe today we could do a talk about the music for Moss. Now, I can tell you in all honesty that the Moss combat tracks are my most favorite combat tracks I've ever written. And let me just play it very briefly and let you know why. That's right, it's in a major key. Now, this totally works for the game, but honestly, this was the first combat track that I did, and I didn't know if Polyarc would go for it or not. And it turns out all the reasons I thought they might not like it were all the reasons that they actually did like it. It doesn't really feel like combat in the traditional sense. But if you're a little tiny mouse fighting wind-up insects that are clockwork, it totally works. Now, this is the pre-stemmed mix. So this is literally what I had straight in Cubase. For all of these tracks, and most of the time when I'm working on a game or a TV show or a trailer, I have this, and then I stem everything, and then I do a mix based on the stems. And then for the soundtrack, those stems are then remixed and mastered as a stereo file for the soundtrack release. So this is basically like the super raw version of what I do when I'm working before it goes anywhere else. So you see, here's some MIDI. This was the MIDI that I used before Kristin played her live parts up here. And down here, this is the MIDI for Jeff's violin, which I moved up here so it would be easy to reference. So that's their parts here. Basically, Kristin and Jeff did this, and then I played all the other stuff. So we've been in G major this whole entire time, and now we just transposed to G minor. It's not really a transposition or a key change, it's just a mode change. That's a little flute that I have around here. So maybe you can tell why I love the combat music from Moss so much. Essentially, it's a VR game and you're playing as this little tiny mouse who's completely fearless and battling things sometimes 10 times her size. I wanted the music to reflect her size, but also her determination and fearlessness. So to me, sort of what you would normally expect for combat music in a video game wasn't really going to work. I didn't want the big pounding drums and the minor powerful French horns. I wanted something more delicate and more inspiring for combat, especially when you see the way she fights. She's got just these amazing animations that are so fluid and natural. So I wanted the score in general and the combat music to be as live as possible. This was a startup company. There were 12 people at Polyarc, I think, when I started working with them, maybe 15, and there wasn't a live budget at all. So what we did was we eked out a little bit of budget to be able to use Kristin, who is in Florida, plays all kinds of amazing woodwinds, and Jeff in LA, who plays violin and viola. So I sussed out parts to them, and then I played as much as I could possibly on my own here in the studio live. So we had basically 10 or 14 live players at any point in time, especially in the combat music because it's a little busier. And the only thing I used MIDI for was occasional low woodwind support, strings, and then occasional brass, but only in the combat. So if we go back to the beginning and get a full view here, I can't fit everything on one screen, but this is all live. Those are all the live tracks, and then everything else down here, from here to the bottom, is MIDI. And you'll notice all the purple is strings. You see some similar things going on. I've got chamber strings from Spitfire and cinematic studio strings doubled up. That was sort of my magical string combination for Moss. I just like the way they sounded together. Cinematic studio strings is a little darker, but really nice legato, and chamber strings is smaller but has really beautiful vibrato that comes through naturally because it's a smaller section. And combining those two together, and I was even using some of the consordino chamber strings as well towards the end. Another thing I love about the chamber strings, they have so many different kinds of legato. So they've got a legato consordino, and then the trem strings, actually, I default more to chamber strings now because they're legato tremolo, which I really like. I was just doubling it up, like for example here, with trems from chamber strings, just to keep the sound even as the strings switched articulations. So that's the MIDI strings, and there's a little bit of drums, just kind of under the combat section, really doing more accents than anything else, not driving powerful rhythmic drums, more just for added weight. And then the timpani and grand cassa are doing the same thing, added weight. And then here is the MIDI horns at the very end, just the big, nice, brassy thing going on with the horns and a little bit of the low brass. And that's a combination of Berlin brass and Spitfire with some adventure brass thrown in, and some nice Berlin low woodwinds. And what I wanted to do first is just go back to the beginning and just play the live. Really, the only MIDI playing here would be the high string sustains, and then there's pizzicato coming in here. But I really like the idea of the live instruments being able to hold their own for the song. So really, the MIDI is there as support, and obviously if we want to get bigger, I have to introduce the MIDI strings and the MIDI brass, but I love the idea of having basically a band that could sit in the corner and do its own thing and be 100% live without it feeling like something's missing. Now see, there's some supported strings coming in there. There's not a lot that I did to a lot of these tracks. Sometimes it's just a little bit of compression. Hear how the accents are louder and the quiet part is quiet? This is hands down my favorite compressor for hand percussion. Haha, get it? Hands down. Unintentional pun. It brings it out with just the right amount of compression and also adds a little bit of top-end sparkle that I really, really like. The acoustic guitar, if we just sit here for a second. I'm not going to sing Fab Filter's praises, I just love them. I mic this with a Telefunken 260 tube mic. It's a small diaphragm tube mic. And it just naturally sounds like that. It's my favorite acoustic guitar. It's a Guild something or other, big sounding, large guitar. But if we bypass that, this is what it sounds like. So really all we're doing here is cleaning out a little bit of the low end. And now with the low end scooped out, a little bit of gain with a tiny bit of compression. With a really fast attack to clamp down on those transients and a sort of medium release. Same mic for the ukulele. I love these Telefunken mics. I love tube mics in general. Tube mics and ribbon mics are kind of my go-tos, unless I'm doing, you know, like drum set when I use maybe some dynamics. But the Fairchild is a wonderful emulation of a tube compressor, and the uke starts at 33. So if we bypass everything, so that's the raw ukulele right off the mic. Just such a natural smooth, especially with the time constant on 5. It's a very natural slow attack and release. And then obviously whatever this frequency is, I wanted less of. And then we're just doing a little bit of top-end sheen here. So I'm scooping out around 3.5, but then I've got a shelf at what looks like 2. So it's sort of like, get rid of this frequency, but then if you saw what this other EQ was doing, it'd be sort of like that. This is kind of what the Neve is doing, is boosting, but we have that frequency carved out. So it's not boosting that frequency, it's boosting the other frequencies. Come on. I love this EQ. I mean, you hear how transparent that is, and what else is going on? Small metal. I did these songs for Moss almost 2 years ago now, so this is as much of a discovery for me as it is for you. Oh, those are little Meinl metal shakers. The 1176 is such a great compressor, and you can never go wrong with both of these more or less pointed to 12 o'clock. It's like a medium attack and release. You dial your input to where you get, 3 or 4 dB of compression on the peaks, and you adjust your output accordingly. What can I say? It just smooths it out, makes it sound more like a finished track. I remember the harp. I remember the harp needing a lot of work because it's a little tiny harp. It's a little tiny Celtic harp that I hold in my lap when I play it. I'm just going to go ahead and take this off because I did not use this denoiser. So if we bypass everything, yeah, see how it's got that sort of ha. I would much rather have a live harp that sounds like that and work with it than use MIDI for the harp. So it was not a question of whether the harp sounded good, it was just a question of what could I do to improve that sound. See, it already sounds better. It sounds more even. And you'll notice I've got sort of a medium and attack and release on the Pro C. Only about 3 dB coming off, and then this is set to a slightly faster with the tube compressor, also 2 or 3 dB. But if they were not on, I hope you can hear how amazing this Fairchild is. This guy right here. It's like, it sounds like it's got EQ on it when you engage it, even though it's just compressing because of the sound of the tubes and everything. All right, and then I did some more. Yeah, that's... Of course, and this is probably a fundamental. Then I wanted even more of that. And I'll do this sometimes. Like if I line these up, you'll see that this frequency is sort of right here. And instead of having a third one, it's just easier. The computer can handle it. I just add another instance of the EQ. So I have, just visually, it's a lither easier to see. It's not like 2 compressors where each one is doing a slightly different thing. This is doing the exact same thing. I just don't like having too many bands all colliding together because it gets a little just mentally and visually confusing for me. And then it looks like I added a multi-band. Still, everything I'm doing here, from the Fairchild to all the EQs and the Pro MB, is trying to tame the top end and bring out a little more of the bottom end. And isn't it amazing the difference that the Pro MB makes? See, it's just over the threshold. Between like 4 and 5 dB, but only when it's attacking in that particular frequency, or in this frequency. So this frequency is sort of the ho that I was talking about when we first heard it, and I hadn't really addressed it that much yet. This is only taking it out when it's hitting, and then same thing with the top end. So you don't want to, like, this is an extreme cut, but I don't necessarily want to cut those mids out because they're important to the sound. It would sound, well, like this, very hollow without them. But this way, it only pulls it out when I want. And you notice it's pulling a lot further down. I've got the threshold set lower on this band than I do up here. This is kind of at like 2 o'clock, and this one's more like 12:30. So I'm constantly pulling out those low ends. And then the last thing, the last magic sauce, which also helps with the bottom end. To me, that's the perfect way of judging the quality of a reverb, is what sort of mids and lows it's adding to the signal. When I first heard my Bricastis, I couldn't believe how much weight and presence and mid-range they added to whatever I put through them, because they're these expensive standalone hardware reverbs. And I hadn't heard anything like that until I got the Lexicon 224. It does the exact same thing. And I'm sure the 480, which just came out for Lexicon on UAD, is just as good. And the other reverb I've heard that's not UAD is FabFilter's Pro R, does the same kind of a thing. Those are my favorite reverbs. So we've got the 224 and the 480 for UAD, and then the Pro R for software only. And I gotta tell you, Vintage Verb by Valhalla does a pretty darn good job. Not quite as much bottom or mid-range boost, but it does give a little bit of oomph there, and it's only $50. It's also very processor efficient. Pro R is pretty processor efficient as well, but it's definitely more expensive, but also more versatile. So I think that's probably a great stopping point for now.